Ladies and gentlemen, the lecture session will begin in 5 minutes. Please kindly take your seats. Please remember to turn off or set your mobile phones to silent mode. Thank you. 各位来宾，唐奖得奖人演讲汉学场即将在5分钟后开始，请您尽速入座。今天的演讲将全程以英文来进行。And ladies and gentlemen, please now give a warm welcome to the Laureate representative for the 2016 Tang Prize in Sinology, Dr. Rachel Chang, and our host, Dr. Fan Seng Wang. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to join us at the Laureate Lecture of 2016 Tang Prize in Sinology. To begin with, let's start by watching a video message from our laureate, Dr. William Theodore DeBerry, to share with us his joy in receiving this year's Tang Prize. Let's now play the video.
I am pleased that on this very important occasion, I can be represented by such a fine young scholar as Dr. Rachel Chang, who has been my partner for years in the development of Asian humanities and the core curriculum at Columbia. Rachel has not only worked very closely with me in both the scholarly preparation of suitable materials for Asia in the core curriculum, but she also joined with me in the presentation to students of this material. Rachel is not only highly qualified among the scholars of her generation, but in some ways is even better able to represent me than I could represent myself. At the age of 97, the infirmities of old age keep me from remembering myself at my prime. But Rachel does not suffer this handicap. It is a great pleasure today to think how Rachel will be carrying on our joint efforts when I am no longer quite able to do so for myself. Thank you.
And now, please welcome to the stage the host of this lecture session, Dr. Fan Seng Wang, former Vice President of Academia Sinica, to give us the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Wang.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2016 Tang Prize Laureate Lecture in Sinology. It is a great pleasure this year to award the second annual Tang Prize in Sinology to Professor William Theodore DeBerry, Di-Bai-Rui or Di-Pei-Li, who truly embodied the spirit of this Tang Prize. Currently, even at the age of 97, DeBerry is still teaching undergraduate at his beloved alma mater, Columbia University. Professor DeBerry's journey into the depths of Chinese culture and history began in 1937. Shortly after arriving on campus, DeBerry took contemporary civilization with Professor Harry Kamen. In the very first session, Professor Kamen drew his students' attention to the absence of non-Western civilization, including Asia, in the syllabus. Struck by his professor's challenge, DeBerry undertook the study of Chinese language and history, a pursuit that most of his classmates found distinctly odd. Now, almost 80 years later, his enthusiasm and spirit for learning have not waned but continue to be burned even brighter. He strived to understand China through its history, ideas, and traditions. Free from Western theory and values, and is recognized for creating a field of Neo-Confucian, 新儒家, 新儒学 studies in North America through his groundbreaking contributions. From the very start, Professor DeBerry has encouraged a dialogue between different cultures as the best way to showcase the value of human rights and resolve key issues facing the world today. He believes that in a chaotic world, there is no other better remedy, and this has been the purpose of his scholarship. This great civilized conversation that Professor DeBerry has dedicated his life to encouraging continue right here, right now, today. While DeBerry is unable to be here with us in person today, but his daughter, Professor Brett DeBerry, is there. Professor Brett. And his student, Dr. Rachel Chong, 郑义静, are here today to continue this conversation with us. Professor Brett DeBerry teaches modern Japanese literature as well as film and comparative literature at Cornell University. Her research interests include modern Japanese fiction and film, the Japanese postmodern, comparative literary theory, translational theory, and post-colonial theory. Dr. Rachel Chong, 郑义静博士, is the Associate Director of the University Committee on Asia and the Middle East, UCAM, as well as a lecturer in Asian Studies at Columbia University. Her research focused primarily on Neo-Confucian culture and intellectual history. As the Associate Director of the UCAM, she has been particularly instrumental in reaching out to the community of leading colleges and universities around the world to build international consensus and cooperation for a truly global core curriculum. Now, let us welcome Dr. Rachel Chong.
It is indeed a very great honor to be standing here to give this year's Tang Laureate Lecture in Sinology before such a distinguished audience. The honor, of course, comes from the yet greater honor and trust given me by Professor William Theodore DeBerry in naming me, together with Professor Brett DeBerry of Cornell University, his representative before the Tang Foundation and the world. When I first encountered Professor DeBerry back in 1996, I don't think anybody had any idea of things coming to this, least of all myself. As a graduate student in musicology with interests in 19th century German Romanticism, I had planned to take only one course on Neo-Confucianism with Professor DeBerry. That one course turned into the next 6.5 years of seminars on Neo-Confucianism. Then at his invitation, ended up joining the work at the University Committee on Asia and the Middle East, or UCAM, as his associate, where I currently serve as de facto director after him. Many people have asked since why I didn't choose to go elsewhere to greener pastures. My answer is that Professor DeBarry is like a great big tree or a mountain in the East Asian sense of such things. It isn't necessarily very accommodating to one's small or immediate needs, but in making one's place in the shade of a great tree or mountain, one has the chance to continually contemplate and discover what makes a mountain a true mountain. One continually discovers new insights into what it means to live the life of deep and genuine humaneness, or Ren, in the Confucian terms. My second and equally important answer is that I've come to understand Professor DeBarry as having become a bridge, more than a bridge builder between East and West. He has shown Neo-Confucianism to be a methodology as much as a philosophy, a methodology available to anyone of any civilization, and thereby actually paving the way towards its globalization. It is on this aspect that I would like to reflect today, especially since much of the world is looking to see in what ways Chinese culture will be becoming a part of the global culture. Most of 20th century scholarship on Neo-Confucianism has focused on its nature as a philosophy or metaphysics. Feng Yulan, Chen Mu, Mu Zongsan, Wing-Tzu Chan, and others who have sometimes been called the new Confucians have all sought to find ways or new interpretive grounds on which to legitimize and reinvigorate Neo-Confucian cosmology in contemporary westernized and scientized terms. This is only natural since Neo-Confucianism has been the intellectual framework on which so much of China's and more broadly East Asian developmental history of the last millennia was founded. Professor DeBarry's interest in Neo-Confucianism, however, took a different direction. His interest in history, despite his keen observations as the editor of the massive Sources book series, which I will come back to later, was less about clarifying the philosophical distinctions between its various movements or schools of thought, or the scholastic analyses of subtleties about such perennial issues as nature and human nature. What he saw in Neo-Confucianism, first and foremost, was a rationale and the methodology for cultural or civilizational renaissance. It may have been serendipity, or perhaps even a path given to him as one who is neither linguistically, nor culturally, nor ethnically Asian. But even in hindsight, all these decades later, it was and remains an extraordinary insight. We might recall that Professor DeBarry first encountered East Asian civilizations and Neo-Confucian thought in particular at a time of radical and often violent change throughout the region. The values of both were under harsh and almost universal criticism or repudiation. In the decades following the Second World War, working with a handful of scholars such as Ryusaku Tsunoda, Hu Shi, Feng Yulan, Lian Fangzong, and Wing-Tzu Chan, who are helping to introduce the humanistic traditions of Asia to those outside in the West. Professor DeBarry, even though only a young man himself at the time, absorbed their scholarship not simply as an aspect of East Asian cultural history, well on its way to being rejected by its own people, but as a perennial principle that speaks to global humanities on its own merit. If we look at the development of Professor DeBerry's scholarship, we know that it began with interest in Huang Zongxi. Later, in his Introduction to Waiting for the Dawn, very famous work, he would write that his interest in Huang stemmed from not wanting to blindly accept the standard Marxist or pseudo-Marxist views of Chinese history and society based on unilinear Western model, and finding in Huang, an acknowledged great historian, a pre-modern but mature, informed, and rational perspective critical of the Chinese dynastic system from within. In my view, Huang became for Professor DeBerry a kind of model or even alter ego, each of them looking to developments from within their own respective civilizations, and in the words of Fang Zongyan, worrying its worries before the common people worries. Huang was, as you know, also the last of the orthodox transcendent Neo-Confucians, aligned with Zhu Xi's Li Shui against the tide of the more materialistic or humanistic interpretation espoused by the Xin Shui school of Wang Yangming. And it was Zhu Xi's idea of the principles of basic human moral nature that functioned as the basic standard of Huang's history. This explains the arc of Professor DeBerry's scholarship, going from Huang Zongxi backward to Zhu Xi. I recall how he would often mention in the classroom Zhu Xi's reinterpretation of loving the people, qinmin, as renewing the people, xinmin. It was his interest in the method of reform and renewal applicable not just in China or in East Asia, but for any civilization, including the West, that made him inquire into issues of Neo-Confucian connection between self, community, and the state on the one hand, and the practical problems of education via core curriculum on the other, recognizing, moreover, as necessary connective tissue between them, the presence of a strong liberal tradition within Confucian culture. Implicit in that interest, he saw Neo-Confucianism as addressing the challenges that the West was confronting and would continue to confront with increasing urgency in the years following the war in terms of questions regarding basic human moral nature. German idealism had spent itself in a destructive end, and in its wake, existentialism in tandem with the rise of superpower politics was a very dangerous mix, as was the growing scientism coupled with tendencies to understand freedom as radical freedom rather than the freedom of cultivated personhood. As we know, Neo-Confucian enterprise was begun in the 11th century as a movement to return to Confucian social and moral values. The purpose of such return was not the private desire of a few scholars wanting to affirm more stringent values of Confucian self-cultivation for or among themselves. If that had been the case, repudiation of Buddhism would not have had to be such a central aspect of their argument, since Buddhism and Confucianism had, after all, coexisted more or less peacefully for centuries, including as complementary rather than conflicting values and scholarly endeavors within individuals. Rather than in the tradition and spirit of Shunzi, the motivation for scholars like Zhang Zai, the Cheng brothers, and of course, Zhu Xi himself, was the evangelical spirit of how to transform and renew society at large. By this time, especially after the arguably well-meant but spectacular failures of Wang Anshe, there was shared recognition that social reforms cannot succeed on the strength of policies from the top down, but rather depends on each member of the general population having some sense of doing right by the community. At the same time, society in the Sung dynasty had become much more urban and complex. Much of the earlier ritual traditions had become irrelevant in this new context. And family, or so-called private values, had become insufficient, if not outright opposed, to sustaining the public good. As a politically weak state, Sung dynasty was moreover constantly under attack from barbarians at various borders, even as it retained cultural memories of the earlier cosmopolitan Tang. So, how to persuade people to be concerned for the welfare of those beyond me and mine in such contexts? It was working out what might be considered such evangelical issues that Neo-Confucian metaphysics was developed over a century as an argument for why it's something humans are meant to do, why it's a natural thing to do, and a good thing to do. Taken as a whole, it was a problem remarkably like the one facing Professor DeBarry's America and the West. Just to illustrate one aspect of this, the United States at one point called itself the melting pot of the world, as you all well know. The term implied the blending of many different ingredients to ultimately produce a dish of a single unified taste, much like a stew or a metal alloy. In the 1960s and 70s, with the experience of the three rights movements, the women's rights and civil rights and anti-war movement, and growing calls to recognize the diversity of voices and experiences in the implementation of sociopolitical ideas, the metaphor was changed to that of a salad bowl, where each ingredient retains its distinct flavor and texture while still presenting a composite taste for the palate. In the 1980s, multicultural became the new catchphrase, with less emphasis on a single composite culture and more on respect and consideration for the many distinct and diverse others within America. More recently, even that ideal has been supplanted by the idea of the global, less about celebrating the diversity of peoples within the United States, and more on understanding the role of the United States as a member of the yet more diverse, decentralized global community. The underlying question throughout this progression has been one of balancing unity and diversity, a question ever more important today in face of Samuel Huntington's influential report that we are moving toward a clash of civilizations. The metaphysical basis for the new Neo-Confucian moral argument had lain in turning the Buddhist and Taoist metaphysics on its heads. Whereas Buddhism and Taoism basically argued that this life on the material or differentiated plane, exists primarily to lead us to the transcendent, undifferentiated plane, the Neo-Confucians reversed this basic framework to assert instead non-polarity yet supreme polarity. The non-polar, transcendent unity is manifest in the material plane characterized by differentiation, giving life in this, in this plane, existential reason or purpose to actualize the harmony of balance of unity and diversity. Today, the challenges to humanity of arriving at a shared metaphysics is arguably much more complex. And rather than focus on Neo-Confucianism as a system of metaphysics, or even as is commonly thought as a system of ethics, Professor DeBarry turned instead to what gave rise to it, to what gave rise to Neo-Confucianism, the ideal of Datong, the harmonious community consisting of self-cultivated individuals. With the idea and ideal of Datong as an achievable human goal, Confucianism over the centuries had expended its energies toward what many have called its distinctive practical character, developing methodology or pedagogy toward cultivation of humanity as exemplified by Juxi. It was this practical aspect that increasingly got Professor DeBarry's attention. Two things occurred in the years between Professor DeBarry's completion of his dissertation on Han Zhongxi that cemented as well as deepened his perspective on both Huang and Neo-Confucianism in terms of one another. First, he was studying in Beijing as a Fulbright scholar when he had to be evacuated first to Nanjing and then later back to the US due to the communist takeover of China in 1949. Despite his strong socialist inclinations as a teenager and a young man, he did not see communism as practiced at that time or in subsequent years as conducive to the comprehensive nature of human values. Second, upon his return to Columbia, he was immediately asked by Harry Carman, that you mentioned, his former teacher and now dean of Columbia, to lead, even before he had finished his dissertation, a new program to incorporate Asia into the core curriculum at Columbia College. So at this point, I think I should provide a brief explanation about Columbia's so-called core curriculum that played such a formative part in Professor DeBarry's development as a scholar. Unlike general education that is the basis of most undergraduate programs at Ivy universities and elsewhere, core curriculum assumes that there are certain essential or core issues that confront humanity and the condition of being human. Columbia does not presume to know or to determine what these issues are. Rather, we look to see what issues have been recurring over and over in the history of humanity and as primary concerns and debate for and by humanity, as well as whose voices in that debate have been consistently acknowledged as adding significantly to that conversation. In short, what constitute the classics. If general education is founded on the need to familiarize students with the basic approaches in the hard and social sciences as well as the humanities, with the, especially as areas of or disciplines of modern study, core curriculum assumes that certain self-awareness, ability for informed reflection, and broad perspective on the condition of being human are necessary preconditions to engaging with the sciences and the humanities in humanly meaningful ways. As a program, core curriculum is therefore geared towards the students' practice and habit of engaged inquiry into the human experience, rather than toward informing students of what that is or even what it ought to be. It is for this reason that we at Columbia insist on students approaching these issues by reading the classics for themselves, rather than reading about them or having them introduced by famous professors or secondary literature. The idea is to have them become participants in the great conversation, rather than to merely to become those who have studied or heard about it. Participants who not only speak with Plato and Confucius, but with their own peers in small discussion-based seminars. So as himself a product of such Columbia undergraduate education, Professor DeBarry had a very deep appreciation for the basic principles of core curriculum, and moreover understood the urgency of making sure this core consisted of more than just the Western tradition. So literally putting his dissertation on hold until 1954, Professor DeBerry turned to the practical tasks of compiling Asian classics for the use in core classes. On the one hand, this involved the translation of individual world classics into accurate, yet beautiful, as well as accessible English, led by such masters of the subtle art as Burton Watson and Donald Keene. And the other was the compilation of the Sources series, beginning with the Japanese and Chinese traditions, followed by the Indian, Korean, and East Asian traditions. A source of Islamic tradition was also planned at the time, but upon learning that University of Chicago was planning a similar project, Professor DeBerry turned to other needs. So let us imagine for a moment what it takes to present the life history of one civilization to another, not as a narrative, but by presenting the actual records of conversations developed over the course of its known existence. Records of central conversations ranging over philosophy, governance, religion, education, historiography, culture, economy, etc., etc. Putting together the sources books meant sifting through vast source materials out there, most of it never before translated, determining which are the most historically significant in the history of ideas among them and why, figuring out how they related to one another, organizing them into a coherent whole, and providing for each entry sufficient context and introduction for the non-specialist student to derive meaning, yet done with such restraint as to minimize the imposing of an editorial perspective. In other words, the sources books were not only a massively ambitious undertaking, but also an incredibly humble one, in that their main purpose was as much as possible to let each civilization speak for itself, to be itself to new audiences rather than mediated through secondary narrative. Obviously, such a massive project could not be completed by any single individual, even one as extraordinarily capable as Professor DeBerry. And this is where the Committee on Asia and the Middle East, or UCAIM, comes in. As established by Professor DeBerry in the early 1950s, CAIM became a unique institution in its time and even now, in that scholars from multiple disciplines, departments, as well as institutions worked closely together in such a way that both their individual and team projects were linked to become building blocks toward a unified and coherent Asian or global core program. Its effectiveness was so phenomenal that Provost Jacques Barzun elevated it to University Committee on Asia and the Middle East in 1957 to indicate the support and involvement of the entire university behind it. To date, UCAIM has been responsible for a publications output of over 160 translations, sources books, teaching guides, and scholarly works, and continues to design courses that are became foundational to what is now called the Global Core component of Columbia's core curriculum. In effect, UCAIM has been the think tank as well as the executive body of the so-called DeBerry School worldwide. And even since 2002, when I first came on board, we organized 7 annual intensive workshops in which over 70 senior faculty came together every year, every day for 2 weeks to read and discuss classics together and to devise from that discussion of East-West comparative courses on such perennial human themes as nobility and civility and nature and human nature. In 2008, UCAM also organized the first international conference on core curriculum called Classics for an Emerging World, where faculty and administrations from many leading universities came together to participate, including Beijing University, Tsinghua, Renmin, Fudan, Taiwan's own National Chiao Tung University, Seoul National, Sungkyunkwan, and so on, as well as Harvard, Yale, Boston, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and many others. Even from this sketchy overview, I think a number of principles in common should be apparent between Professor DeBerry's approach to establishing Asian core as part of Columbia's core and Zhu Xi's formulation of New Confucian curriculum as methodology toward social, moral, and cultural renaissance. First, there is the insistence on students engaging directly with the classics themselves rather than with secondary sources. Among other reasons, this is to respect the dignity and responsibility of the students as persons deserving to wrestle with some of humanity's greatest thinkers and most important issues. Second, the essential role of conversation in humanistic cultivation, not just between students and the classic texts or with their teachers, or even the classics in debate with one another, but for students to engage in discussion with one another about the issues as relevant to them. As we all know, this was a point emphasized by Zhu Xi himself in the famous halls of the White Deer Grotto Academy. Discussion is not just a matter of asserting one's own views aloud and then letting others assert theirs own in turn. It is rather learning how to listen, how to think through differences of thought with openness and change, to practice the civility and liberality of understanding, and not least, to ensure that issues are not considered in the abstract, but through the thick experience of people's actual lives, including one's own. Third, both have as their goals the renewal of people via making humanistic education and self-cultivation accessible to all. Of course, this is difficult to realize in practice, but it is one of the reasons Professor DeBerry continues to insist on making all UCAM translations and source books in very readable format for general reading public, not full of footnotes and digressions that would be of interest to the specialist in the field alone. Fourth, Zhu Xi is considered by many to be the synthesizer of his Neo-Confucian predecessors. In other words, he did not establish Li Shui alone, nor did his curriculum get spread by him alone. In fact, it faced an uphill battle until Kublai Khan adopted it for his own reasons as the new orthodox standard for civil service examinations. So likewise, the DeBerry School at present is dependent on the proactive participation and outreach of those who share in its principles to keep it going. Finally, at the base of both Professor DeBerry and Zhu Xi is the fundamental and humane humility of knowing that no human being is God or the way, and that therefore it is not given to anyone to try to do more than to point to the way and sincerely provide opportunities via education for others to also get there should they wish it. To try to somehow control more than this is not to trust the humanity of our fellow human beings. As Professor Ewing Sher said in his closing to the inaugural Tang Laureate lecture here 2 years ago, the ultimate standard of history is respect for human dignity. This last point leads to another that I think deserves mention. Recently, while being interviewed for a film about Professor DeBerry, I described his work as inherently political, yet non-political at the same time. He himself has said that his approach to Neo-Confucianism was political rather than philosophical, but by political, he means it in the sense of the Greek polis, as in the idea of the civic community. Even when he describes himself as liberal, democratic, and socialist, he doesn't mean them in terms of political parties or ideologies, so much as fundamental orientations or aspirations of humanity toward broadening, liberating, and disputatious learning motivated by the communitarian spirit. So when he was elected the president of the Association of Asian Studies back in 1969, during the height of the Vietnam crisis, for example, his inaugural address pointed out that the group's charter identified it as a non-political organization, and that therefore the association should be non-political but not unconcerned, serving proactively as an open forum for the expression of different scholarly views on major political issues. It was much the same in 1968 when there was the student riots at Columbia, when he told students that they had a right to be concerned with issues of the day, but that they could not stop the business of learning and civility on that account. As a scholar and a sinologist as well, Professor DeBerry is known for investigating things from a broad and integral perspectives. This was perhaps partly the influence also of the way he got to know Asia, meeting Japanese as well as Korean prisoners of war as a naval officer, and later learning much about Confucianism from people like Tsunoda and Edwin Reischauer. Asia for him is not individual countries vying for identity or ideology, but a civilization connected by common human concerns and values. And what I want to suggest here is the possibility that the globalization of Neo-Confucianism as a methodology rather than a specific philosophy, as shown by Professor DeBerry, may be not just applicable in the field of education as such, but an example of an exemplary, alternative, non-political approach to how it might be possible to universalize cultures without either losing or imposing cultural identity. And I think this would be a significant point in how Chinese culture becomes adopted and adapted as a part of global culture. Cultural and identity politics are fast becoming major issues around the world, with or without Samuel Huntington to tell us so. And as my final point, I would like to reflect on that in relation to Professor DeBerry's life and work. Professor Ewing Sher 2 years ago, during his Tang Laureate lecture, stressed that while many Chinese people today have renewed confidence in the longevity, strength, and the enduring qualities of the Chinese way, and are eager to see it become a part of global culture, it is imperative for Chinese history and culture to be studied in the context of world culture and history. It is easy to see how Professor DeBarry has truly exemplified this approach, not only in how his own scholarship has widely ranged over many civilizations of the world, but in the way he has year-long undergraduate core courses in which students read and discuss classics and documents from India, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the West in relation to one another. An important effect of this, of course, has been to make students aware of the broad commonalities and differences between civilizations. But another equally important effect has been to show in historically specific terms how globalization has been taking place for centuries, thereby empowering students to consider more rationally and critically its paths in the future. After all, cultural practices originating in China certainly spread throughout East Asia, but they were not merely copied or adopted or imposed whole cloth. Rather, they were engaged with, selectively adapted, and what I call interculturated by each receiving culture in and for its own contexts. If there is an important difference between Juxi's and Columbia's core curricula, it is that Juxi's core curriculum marked the revitalized affirmation of Confucian values as culmination of the process I call interculturation, whereas Columbia's core curriculum has yet to get through the idea of globalization. By interculturation, I mean that process by which an idea, value, or practice from outside oneself is recontextualized or reborn in such a way that it not only finds expression properly adapted to the new receiving culture, but becomes a powerful generative force or creative principle that revitalizes and unifies that culture, transforming and remaking it organically from within. Indeed, an important distinction between interculturation and globalization is that the creative energy unleashed by the former is so great that it results in mutual enrichment and transformation. Buddhism, as you well know, for example, not only transformed Chinese culture, but was itself transformed by Chinese culture to such an extent that we can no longer think of Buddhism without Chinese culture. While this is neither the time nor the place for a detailed discussion of interculturation, this clearly confutes the idea that openness to values from outside oneself results in the flattening or the negation of cultural identity, and by the same token resists the notion of culture as fixed or endemic. Indeed, when Juxi repudiated Buddhism, it was with the understanding that Lu Xue itself had been possible only through the mature absorption and digestion of Buddhist challenges. One might say that in its own time, Neo-Confucians had succeeded in separating the Buddhist methodology for philosophizing from its actual philosophy, and adapted the former to reinvigorate Confucian values. Professor DeBarry likewise, I think, ultimately envisions a curricular structure where a deep appreciation of one's own civilization or tradition is balanced with the ability to reconsider it critically through ideas and challenges from others. As yet, however, neither East nor West is in a position of having so interculturated the other. I have sometimes heard Professor DeBarry say that he himself felt an exile vis-a-vis both the East and West, with a sense of interior distance, observing each from the standpoint of the other. I don't know whether this is an ability he cultivated or a burden he was given to bear. I think perhaps a bit of both. The gift of that is the sense of perspective in which one can be both deeply engaged and free at the same time. The kind of perspective that was, I believe, the ultimate goal of Neo-Confucian humanistic enterprise, and that Professor DeBarry embodies so much in his own person, and that he tries to inculcate through his efforts to incorporate Asia into the core curriculum at Columbia and beyond. So, tall, brown-haired, blue-eyed, Professor DeBarry, like many before and after him, set out to become a bridge builder between East and West. But in allowing the world's civilizations to speak for themselves and showing what it is to apply Neo-Confucianism as a methodology for cultural renewal, even in non-Asian world contexts, he instead became a cornerstone of the bridge itself. That is, a bridge every person interested in interculturation must necessarily cross. A sinologist, he did not assume the boundaries of sinology, given either as a regional area or an academic discipline. And it is this legacy which the next generation of the DeBarry School at UCAM, Taiwan, and all over the world need to carry on. So thank you very much, Professor DeBarry. And on behalf of Professor DeBarry, thank you, Dr. Samuel Yin, and all the members of Academia Sinica and the Tang Prize Foundation for bringing honor and recognition of the work of such conversations across civilizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel Chong, for this enlightening speech. Especially you mentioned that the interculturations, that is a very insightful points that we should ponder on it in the further days. And you also put it best when you describe Professor DeBarry as a bridge builder who himself became the bridge, and that is very insightful. Since the time is almost up, so we have a press release after this inaugural speech. After this speech, so I think we not going to take any questions. As the host of this this speech, I'd like to conclude a little bit about. I myself don't know Professor DeBarry. I'm too young to be his student, but I was an avid reader of many of his books, including especially the earliest ones, Unfolding of Neo-Confucianism, Self and Society of Ming Thought, and especially the trouble with Confucianism. I remember I mentioned in the announcement days that the only time I met Professor DeBarry, without exchanging any words, was after 六四天安门 1989. There was a conference in New York, organized by United Daily 联合报 to celebrate. Later, I remember, perhaps the 80th birthday of the founder of the United Daily, Wang Tiwu's 80th birthday. If I recall it correctly. In that conference, Professor DeBerry kept mentioning that we have to watch that if this student movement have any institutional legacy. That's what he repeated. And that is the only face I remember of that conference. So Professor DeBerry has indeed become the bridge between the East and the West. His promotion of the core curriculum has encouraged us to free and delve into core essential issues that confront humanity. This is the foundation of the great globalized conversation that he has pioneered. In this great conversation, we need students, scholars, citizens worldwide, and all of you seated here today to play an active role. Each individual brings to this conversation a unique perspective and outlook that further enrich this conversation. While this concludes the 2016 Tang Prize Laureate Lecture in Sinology, this great civilized conversation that Professor DeBerry has dedicated his life to encouraging will certainly continue on. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor DeBerry and Professor Rachel Zhong and Professor Brett DeBerry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Wang, for hosting the session for us. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the Sinology lecture. Thank you very much for your participation. 各位来宾，第二届唐奖得奖人的汉学场到此圆满结束，非常感谢您今天的参与。离场的时候，请勿遗忘将同步口译接收器归还到您所租借的服务区，并且记得您随身携带的物品。祝您有个美好的一天，谢谢。